A very good afternoon to everyone. It gives me immense happiness to welcome everyone to this talk on negotiating integration, rehabilitation in the Andaman Islands, 1965 to 1980. For this talk, we have with us Dr. Raka Banerjee, who is a junior fellow with us. I think this is her first lecture after she joined the fellowship, and she has done considerable amount of field work as well. I'm aware of it because I have gone through the report of the field work that she had submitted, and I have been interacting with her, of course, on this subject. So I extend a very warm welcome to her as well. This subject is very important in many ways. One of the ways in which this subject is important is that when we talk about the partition of India and the consequences of the partition, and especially the human cost of the partition, our focus, both of political scientists and historians and of others also, has mostly been on those people who came from what is. May I request everybody to put their phones on silent mode. So the focus of most scholars, historians, etc. has been on the refugees, on the people who came from what is now Pakistan, both from Punjab, the northwestern frontier province, and of course from Sindh also. Whereas the reality is that a similar kind of partition, though in some ways different, happened in eastern India as well, which was the partition of Bengal. And the partition of Bengal took away about 60% of the population of the undivided Bengal to what became East Pakistan and what is now Bangladesh. And a smaller part, both in terms of area and population, remained with India. So now what happened was that as a result of the fact that in the case of what is now Pakistan, the migration of people happened within a couple of years only, from say 1946 to 1948-49. So there was a wave of migration, some 5 to 6 million people came, they were rehabilitated over the years, they were given lands in Punjab, Haryana, other places, and there was a policy, government worked and an entire bureaucracy was put in place for this purpose. And of course the whole country also became aware of the problems of the people, the human cost, the tragedy that these people who suffered, violence and loot of their property and so many other humiliations that they had to suffer. Now in the case of Bengal, the migration was spread out over decades. There was a wave, of course, at the time of partition, but it wasn't as significant, and the violence that happened in East Bengal was also not as large scale, as serious as it happened in the case of Punjab or northwestern frontier province. Maybe this was one of the reasons that less attention was paid to the people, to the refugees who came from what is now Bangladesh in 1947 and the later years. And especially in historiography, we find that relatively less work has been done on their rehabilitation. And that is also the reason that many of us may not be aware that a large number of the people who came after the partition, they were settled in the Dandakaranya region in central India. And of course there were problems associated with that, they were given lands. Now many of those people who came from East Pakistan at that time belonged to the so-called lower castes. So there were various considerations, of course, of whether they were landless, whether they had land or not, what kind of property will have to be given to them in order to settle them on land. And it was probably thought by the Indian state at that time that if they could be given some substantial amount of land, then their social economic status could also be uplifted apart from helping them in sort of moving over the trauma of partition and of migration from there. So I'm not questioning the success of these policies. Certainly they were reasonably successful in the context of that time. But the other part is, and which is what I have given this entire background, but of course now the focus of Raka's lecture today, I believe, is going to be on a small part of these people who were, I think, mostly from the Namshudra community of East Bengal, who were settled and rehabilitated in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. And as we know, Andaman and Nicobar Islands have a certain strategic significance. In fact, it has increased over the decades, and it was discovered during the Second World War. INA had also occupied some of these islands for about a couple of years. So the Indian state was obviously concerned about sort of settling people there, because unless the islands were settled, it was difficult to defend them, and of course it was difficult to develop them. So as a result of this, it was thought that maybe some of these people can be settled there, land is abundantly available, their status can be uplifted, they can get relief, and at the same time some strategic purpose is also going to be served. Now, what are the mechanisms through which this integration of the people there happened? What were the problems and challenges they faced? I believe that this is going to be the focus of Raka's talk today. So with these words, I would once again welcome everyone to this talk and request Dr. Raka Banerjee to proceed with her lecture.
Thank you, Dr. Mishra. I would like to thank PMML for its generous fellowship, which has allowed me the time and the space to undertake this ongoing research. I have only a few slides to show the photographs of where I conducted my fieldwork, but mostly I'll be reading out. So I'll begin with a note on the structure of my talk. I'll begin with a brief introduction to the context of settlement in the Andaman Islands, the population that was settled, then a detailed discussion on the Rashtriya Vikas Dal, or the RVD scheme of settlement in Middle Andaman, which is the focus of this talk. And finally, how the active negotiation of the settlers with the state via the island administration shaped the very specifics of the scheme and engendered new networks both inter and intra-island as well as mainland and island. So with that, a brief introduction to the context of settlement. Andaman and Nicobar Islands, located in the Bay of Bengal, demarcating the border waters of South Asia and Southeast Asia, has been predominantly projected as a geopolitically sensitive, strategic location in the frontier zone, both in need of colonizing by its territorial claimants as well as development into an outpost to thwart territorial aggressors. It has been projected as both terra nullius, devoid of agential inhabitants, and a wild terrain in need of conquest. The three prominent phases of the history of this archipelago, British colonial period, the Japanese occupation period, and the post-independence period, are bound by a desire to productively utilize utilize the island's space and resources, and to this end, transportation of various mainland populations has been made the mode of operationalizing such colonial and post-colonial designs. The the Japanese occupation of the Andaman Islands between 1942 and 45 had led to a serious crisis of the island's infrastructure and resources, most notably the depletion of agriculture and shortage of labor. Being an island, Andaman provided the perfect opportunity to test out newer systems of agriculture, which, if successful, could be implemented on a larger scale in the mainland. On the other hand, post-partition Bengal was faced with inflation, lack of food, inadequate resources, diminished rate of revenues for divided Bengal, crisis in the prosperous jute industry, and an ever-increasing flow of refugees which further worsened the condition of an already struggling province. As a result, the Andaman scheme, which was initially meant to accommodate the refugees of the Punjab partition, was extended to the Bengali refugees. The colonization scheme, which was led by the Relief and Rehabilitation Department and the government of West Bengal between 1949 and 60 in South, Middle and North Andaman, was not successful in either inducting as many settler families as the administration had hoped for reclaiming the projected quota of lands required to settle the island as a thriving colony. The settled population failed to meet the demand for non-agricultural occupations in the island. So these concerns regarding the nature of the island colony, coupled with geopolitical concerns in the aftermath of the Sino-Indian War of 1962, led to a serious deliberation on the existing vulnerabilities and the nature of development that was required to fortify this border sea region of Bay of Bengal. Under these circumstances, a bolder plan was necessary for the integrated and accelerated development of the islands. At the time of reconstitution of states in 1964, the Ministry of Rehabilitation was made responsible for the development of special areas which were earmarked in the fourth plan. Andaman and Nicobar Islands was the first to be declared such a suitable area for integrated resource development. According to the Ministry of Rehabilitation report by the Interdepartmental Team on Accelerated Development Program for Andaman and Nicobar Islands, the goal of accelerating development in these designated areas was the utmost productive utilization of its natural and human resources. Manpower and transport were identified as the two biggest challenges to the successful implementation of the scheme. The team identified 3 regions of Andaman Islands as being most suitable for development under this specific scheme. First was Little Andamans, second is Neel Island, which is now has been renamed as Shohid Deep, and the third is Betapur in Middle Andaman along with Great Nicobar as well. The need for a diverse cultural mix of population was stressed as a national imperative of the future settlements in the earmarked locations, as it would provide for a stronger base for the economy and security of the islands. As a result, the focus shifted from an exclusive preference for East Pakistan Bengali refugees, who continued to be seen solely as farmers, to a diverse mix of populations dictated by their specific skills and perceived competencies in contributing to the island's development in unique ways. The Bengali settlers were given priority for resettlement on paddy lands, and emphasis was and those with experience in saltwater fishing were inducted into coastal fishing programs. Special emphasis was put on the development of plantations to raise coconut, areca nut, rubber and coffee crops, which according to the report required the selection of repatriates from Ceylon who were experienced in plantation work. The report identified that the state of Kerala could provide plantation workers while Andhra Pradesh could provide both fishermen for offshore fisheries and plantation workers. Most significantly, the report identified the need for some sturdier stock of people from the mainland, particularly ex-servicemen, due to the island's peculiar location, away from the mainland, which posed security issues in the context of a sensitive geopolitical location. Overall, the rehabilitation scheme settled an area of 11,465 acres, with 803 Bengali, 45 Burmese, 72 Sri Lankan, and 330 ex-servicemen families. So the current research focuses on the rehabilitation scheme, and this paper in particular focuses on the settlement of Bengali RVD or Rashtriya Vikas Dal workers in Betapur, Middle Andaman between 1965 and 1973. Approximately 80% of the island's Bengali settler population belongs to the Nomoshudro caste group, practicing the Motua religion, which began as a social movement against Brahmanical hegemony, untouchability and oppression of Nomoshudros in the early 19th century in Faridpur, East Bengal, whose political and social unity was gravely affected by the event of partition and their dispersal across the Indian states and present-day Bangladesh. As a result of the partition, the Nomoshudro habitation zone, as Bandopadhyay and Basure Chaudhuri calls it, encompassing the districts of Borishal, Khulna, Faridpur and Joshore, that was critical for successful caste mobilization in undivided Bengal, went almost entirely to East Pakistan. Once a powerful political force, they came to be seen as a Hindu minority in East Pakistan, and in West Bengal they lost their political bargaining power due to loss of their demographic and geographic advantage. It is pertinent to note here that most Namashudras did not have the capital to migrate immediately after the partition, and Jogendranath Mondol's assurance of a scheduled caste homeland in East Pakistan persuaded many to stay back, even after their wealthier upper caste Hindu patrons had moved across the border to India. It was not until the 1950s, under circumstances of increasing communal violence and economic pressures, that a large-scale migration of Namashudra people took place. The Motua Mahasangho, led by P.R. Thakur, who is also the grandson of the Motua religious leader Guruchand Thakur, played a crucial role in encouraging Namashudra refugees to settle in places outside West Bengal, where they would receive land for resettlement, and this included Dandakaranyas as well as Andaman Islands, in order to build what he called a new Bengal. This particular population that I include in my study here crossed over to India in the early 60s, primarily into the state of West Bengal, from where they were dispersed to camps in central India, especially in the Dandakaranya region and the present-day states of Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh and Odisha. Participants of this research were part of 350 RVD families that received rehabilitation benefits in Billy Ground region of Middle Andaman. The eldest participant used to be a cluster leader who arrived with the very first batch of refugees, and he claims to be over 90 years old. All the other participants belonging to the original RVD group are also in their 70s and 80s. Of the surviving 25 or so RVD workers, I was able to interview one cluster leader and his wife, one cluster leader who is the eldest surviving member of the community, one RVD worker and his wife, one RVD worker, his wife and his son, two individual RVD workers, one dependent member who is also the brother of a deceased RVD worker, the current Pradhan who is the son of a deceased RVD worker, his wife and his mother, two informants who were local school teachers, and one social worker who belongs to a RVD family himself and runs an NGO in Billy Ground. This comes to a meager 17 respondents with varying degrees of participation in the interview process, but the field interactions have been corroborated with and read along with the archival documents available in the Port Blair Secretariat Archive, which allowed me to bring both the archival evidence to the settlers for elaboration and vice versa. So, Betapur is located about 201 kilometers north of the capital city of Port Blair. It is part of the Mayabandar Tehsil of the North and Middle Andaman district and geographically situated in the Middle Andaman region of the Greater Andaman Archipelago. Betapur is one of the few valleys with a predominantly flat terrain in the island. While the area of implementation of the rehabilitation scheme in Middle Andaman was headquartered in Betapur, the population brought under the scheme was settled across the valley, particularly in the Billy Ground region, a few kilometers south. The participants of this research are settled in the villages of Horinagor, Pinakinagor and Swadeshnagar. In this specific scheme of settlement, refugees were brought from Mana and Kurut camps of Madhya Pradesh as part of the Rashtriya Vikas Dal or National Development Course to clear the deforested lands and reclaim these for agricultural and industrial employment. Able-bodied, fit young men were inducted from amongst the camp population to be trained for the RVD, which was tasked with creating a salaried labor force that would be employed for undertaking development activities in specifically backward areas of the Indian territory. In keeping with the agenda of transforming demoralized refugees into disciplined, self-reliant workers and useful citizens, the scheme was launched in 1964 in order to, first, provide disciplined workers for the execution of development projects, second, to provide gainful employment to migrants, and second, to provide gainful employment to migrants. The idea was to instill the habit of manual work in the migrants and propagate among them the ideal of dignity of labor. In March 1965, 182 families comprising of 465 persons were brought to the transit camps in Middle Andaman, which was followed by a second batch of 200 families, and as a result, 382 families comprised of 990 people were brought from the mainland to Betapur under the scheme. These workers, or sehkaris as they were called, were organized into smaller groups under a cluster leader who would oversee the group's operations on behalf of the administration. The goal was to clear 2,000 to 2,500 acres of land in 1 year, as the Betapur region had 3,000 to about 4,000 acres of uncleared land from previous settlement operations by the Forest Department due to the region's inaccessibility. The newly established RRO, that is Rehabilitation Reclamation Organization, was in charge of managing the RVD workers to achieve this goal through fully mechanized forest clearance techniques. The RVD workers were employed in PWD roadworks in order to construct roads that would reach the dense forests, without which it was not possible to drag commercial timber from the forest to the depots. In addition to forest and road works, workers were also gainfully employed in a state farm. A 60-acre research and demonstration farm was established to train the settlers in modern cultivation methods. The Agriculture Department provided them with tractors, power sprayers, hand sprayers, and other necessary equipment. And a 10-acre unit of soil conservation and demonstration center was also set up, but this task could not be adequately implemented or completed. Scholars claim this scheme was implemented in a great hurry, and the Ministry of Rehabilitation started sending in people without putting the infrastructure into place. They were brought 2 years in advance of the actual project and had to wait the longest to receive settlement lands, as the indigenous Jaroa land was being cleared on either side of what is the Andaman Trunk Road. The construction of the ATR or Andaman Trunk Road and the establishment of settlements in this region heavily circumscribed the Jaroa habitat, and as a result, those were also areas of prime hostility between indigenous and settler populations. 8 years since its inception in 1965, the project was declared completed in 1973. In the end, between 68 and 69, the RVD families were settled on 2,050 acres of agricultural land in Billy Ground, and the Betapur project was deemed an apparent success. This paper argues if this successful rehabilitation is the result of state-settler negotiation, and with examples, it will demonstrate how this process of negotiation allowed for individual officers to make exceptions in case of certain settlers. According to cluster leader Uttam Haldar, names have been changed to protect the participants. According to cluster leader Uttam Haldar, the sense of deception and skepticism had permeated the morale of RVD workers long before they arrived in Andaman. At the end of their training in Mana and Kurut camps in January 65, tractors bearing soil digging tools and RVD uniforms arrived at the camp office. Haldar was instructed by the camp commander Shorkar sir to assemble all the Sahakaris of his cluster in order to unload the equipment and uniforms. And I quote, "When I began unloading the stuff from the tractor, I was disappointed. We were asked to do physical labor even though we were given military training. So they were given arms training as well as physical exercises to train them over the months for the RVD program. These tools were signs of a kind of manual labor that was being expected from us. We were sweepers, we were labor," unquote. The workers were neither apprised of the nature of work expected of them once the training was over, nor were they made aware of the unfamiliar ecology of the islands. We were only given a booklet that said Rashtriya Vikas Dal, which primarily meant the task of developing the nation, and in order to do so, we would have to clear drains and cut jungles, which made me sad. Needless to say, even while the workers agreed to being transported to Andaman as part of RVD, they began devising their own plans regarding the nature of rehabilitation they truly wanted. We would worry how we were going to maintain our families, their progenies and later generations on the basis of contractual RVD work, as each family had only one salaried male head of the household. In a similar vein, Nolini Hauladar and his wife Geeta Hauladar complained, "We were told that we would be given settlement within 3 years, but in reality, they started prolonging this process as they wanted to make us work for another 3 years." According to another local social worker, these people were given such a grand name, Rashtriya Vikas Dal, implying they will work for the development of the nation, yet they were overworked by the administration to no end. Without any promise of land-based rehabilitation measure and an ever-looming threat of being transported elsewhere to work as RVDs again, the workers felt the need to confront the administration for better rehabilitation facilities. Faced with the possibility of falling short of the required number of RVD workers necessary for the task of clearing Middle Andaman, the state was willing to make exceptions on a number of issues, like the family composition and age of RVD workers for transportation, what happens to the RVD after Middle Andaman project is completed, the number of families that could be settled in Middle Andaman, bringing separated relatives and family from the mainland, and conceding to settlers' protests and demands on issues like pardon of loans, expansion of educational and other infrastructural facilities. At the start of the scheme, the administration had strict rules for recruitment and an age cutoff of 24 years. Moreover, the ideal family unit to be transported was supposed to be a 2-member unit. The administration failed to attract enough number of eligible candidates as per this criteria, and consequently men of all ages and different household compositions began enrolling for the scheme. This is how Shomoresh Bapari, who is at least a decade older than Uttam Haldar, became RVD workers. Haldar was in Orissa when he learned that 4-member families were also being allowed to go to Andaman, so he was finally deemed eligible for the scheme. Haldar retorted with a victor's laugh. In the beginning, they pointed to these rules, but later they dismissed all rules and willingness to go to Andaman was enough. Another point of contention was that not all RVD units were family units. About 10 single men were recruited for transportation, and since single men or unattached women were not eligible to claim rehabilitation from the state, they had to be married off if they wanted to receive facilities. The camp commandant from Kurut camp in mainland, who accompanied the first batch of RVD settlers to the island, one kind-natured upper caste official whom Uttam Haldar addressed as Mukherjee Sahib, instructed all the bachelor RVD men to get married so that they could get land there. There were settler girls in nearby settlements. Mukherjee Sahib trained the men to become RVD and arranged their marriages as well. So they both became RVD workers as well as head of the family. No other officer did us this favor. He was a good man. While at Mana camp, Geeta Hauladar, who was then Geeta Odhikari, her father took up rehabilitation in the Chanda district of Maharashtra, while her elder brother trained as RVD and came to Andaman. Once he reached Andaman, he realized this place is almost like our Bangladesh as everything grows well, so it would be wise to stay here. Geeta Haldar says, we had grown up on a diet of rice and fish in Bangladesh. When we were in Madhya Pradesh, we would only get roti and maybe some rice once a week. That just doesn't suit us. As a result, her brother Shomir Odhikari, who was single and therefore ineligible for rehabilitation, started employing various techniques to bring the rest of the family from Chanda to Andaman. Owing to his rapport with the camp commandant Mukherjee, an exception was made for Odhikari, and the commandant wrote to New Delhi requesting that his family be transported to the island as well. And I quote him, just for this one family, they sent a truck which brought them from Maharashtra to Calcutta, where they were fetched by a rehabilitation department staff who boarded them onto a ship at Khidirpur dock. I received them from Port Blair. Like Haldar and Odhikari, Ashok Mondol too recounted camp commandant S.K. Mukherjee along with Bengali doctor named Prashanto Ray and a non-Bengali or Obangali officer amongst the very first and immediate authority figures in the new settlement. Under the unfamiliar islandic circumstances, a language and a shared geography of origin emerged as powerful means of maintaining cohesion, and by granting certain wishes, the administration hoped to ensure the RVD's optimum collective performance. The RVD workers had come to realize that the land was quite fertile in Middle Andaman. On the one hand, it was becoming increasingly apparent that the administration was unwilling to allot lands for their settlement. Dhiren Sarkar revealed Camp Commandant S.K. Mukherjee advised the RVD cluster leaders to frame their demands very carefully, as the workers stood a good chance of being rehabilitated in Middle Andaman. They were advised to ask for settlement there, as it would be very hard to find a place like Andaman anywhere else in India. Upon being advised by the Babu, the leaders relayed this information to the rest of the workers, and they began a strike demanding settlement right there in Billy Ground, as they didn't want to be taken elsewhere. According to Ashok Mondal, since the workers forced their hand, the government only gave them land and no other facilities like ready houses, tools, utensils and cattle, and they had to sit on strikes for each and every issue. Further, unlike the earlier colonization scheme settlers who received 30 bighas or around 10 acres of land, the settlers of rehabilitation scheme only received a total of 16 bighas, comprised of 5 acres or 15 bighas of cultivation land and 1 bigha for house site. Since the region was a mix of plain lands and hilly terrain, the cultivation lands were allotted in plain paddy land and the location of house sites were adjusted according to availability of land in the region. In 1967, the administration decided to conduct a blind lottery to allot these plots to individual RVD families, and Camp Commandant Mukherjee left soon after their allotment by lottery was completed. Shomoresh Bapari was one of the key RVD cluster leaders who was at the forefront of the struggle for rehabilitation. As they began clearing lands for the RVD families, they realized that out of 350 families, only 300 could be accommodated there. Moreover, at the time of lottery, it was revealed that 10 families belonged to the small trader category and was therefore ineligible for rehabilitation on agricultural land. These families had been handpicked by Bapari, who is a Motua person himself, and I quote him here, those 10 families comprised of 2 Thakurs, 1 Napit, and it's a pejorative term, but he uses it so I'm quoting him on it. So 2 Thakurs, 1 Napit, 1 Chamar, because he felt that one might require their caste services in the new settlement. He says, wherever Bengali Samaj has been settled, there are some Shamajik Kajkormo, social norms and rituals that one needs to conduct, right? And one needs them for those ritual tasks. End of quote. While all settlers claim that caste was never an issue for them and that Andaman continues to be a casteless society, caste identity probably played a crucial role in their informal selection for the scheme. Bapari assumed a responsibility for the rehabilitation of these 10 families from a Hindi-speaking staff at the surveyor's office who would frequent Bapari's house for fresh milk. Bapari found out that 3 families could be accommodated in Billy Ground itself. Another 4 families had already decided to take up small trader facility, that is a house site and a business loan to launch their businesses. And 2 RVD turned settler families had left their lands and repatriated to the mainland. So these plots became available for 2 more families who were waiting to be settled. For the remainder 1 family, he located a strip of land right next to a small stream which had not been cleared for the task of settlement, which had nearly 20 bighas of land. Laughing with contentment, Bapari concluded, and thus all 10 families were settled here in Billy Ground. Settlement in Billy Ground, however, did not spell the end of their hardship, instead opening them up to newer challenges that involved adaptation to the island ecology, devising newer ways of protecting their crops from wild pigs and deer, alterations to their diet in order to decimate this animal population, and adopting cultivation work like raising plantations, which most of them were unfamiliar with. The new settlers were pitted against previous Bengali settlers and neighboring Malayali settlements to compete for infrastructural support like secondary and higher secondary schools for the settler children. Some even got arrested during the protests and spent a few months in cellular jail as an aftermath of their attempts to secure benefits from the state. The area where Billy Ground market stands today used to be rocky. Bapari put together a team to break down the rocks and level the area in order to establish a Hari Mandir the night before the administration was going to hold the lottery for settlement. They held an overnight kirtan at the newly established temple and assembled for lottery the next morning. The 2 religious groups, Motuas and Vaishnavas, existed since the population was in Mana and Kurut camps. But in the islands, many took Motua initiation, particularly under the discipleship of one Motua guru, Monu Gosai of Diglipur. Carola Lauria finds in her research this social as well as religious network also played an important role in bringing more people to the islands outside of governmental schemes for settlement. Motua festivals, particularly Baruni Mela, which is a celebration of the birth of Horichand Thakur, is a prime folk festival in the Andamans, and it draws both inter-island Motuas and devotees from the mainland alike. While Motua religion helped recreate a sense of home in the islands, it was in turn shaped by altered practices and specificities of the islandic location. For instance, settlers started using the island's valuable pedok tree to carve the donka drum, which is an essential for all Motua practices and the very symbol of the Motua community. The drum membrane, which used to be made out of goat skin in the mainland, was being fashioned out of deer skin in the island because the settlers would regularly hunt the island's large deer population, which was a threat to their agriculture. In addition to the intermeshing of island's ecology with the settlers' material culture and practices, Motua ritual practices and lore underwent changes as well. The power of these faith practices in binding the local settler community in an alien islanded location was not lost on government officials in charge of their settlement. Correspondence between Shadhon Raha, Tehsildar of Middle Andamans, and S.N. Moitro, Chief Commissioner of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, reveals there was a practice of providing each sailing refugee family with khols and kartals in addition to other standard articles of necessity. These are musical instruments mainly used in kirtans and folk performances of rural Bengal. The settlers were given one pair of kartal every 5 families and one khol for every 20 families. The Chief Minister of West Bengal had not sanctioned the purchase of these instruments in the year of 1955, but we find that the then Refugee Rehabilitation Commissioner, Raka Banerjee, assuring Shadhon Raha of procuring the funds if the Chief Commissioner could write to him, stressing the necessity of these articles for the settlers. In response, the letter to the Refugee Rehabilitation Commissioner stressed the settlers' requests for these musical instruments, and I quote, so that they can keep up their social and devotional life. In addition to khols and kartals for the settlers, the letter requested for a gift of one harmonium for one Jogeshwar Mistri, a settler of the remote island of Havelock, who he claimed had good voice. This is an important clue to the centrality of congregational singing and spiritual gatherings to the heart of community making in the new island settlements. Moreover, official correspondence also mentions a sum of rupees 600 was received by the Refugee Rehabilitation Commissioner for the purchase of garments for one Jatra Gan party, which is a local folk theatre troupe. It can be inferred from these archival evidence that devotional singing and gatherings were significant in sustaining the cultural and spiritual lives of the new settlers, and the island administration was not only keenly aware of its importance in maintaining the morale of the community, but also for the continuation of these isolated pockets of settlement villages in remote island spaces. This, however, does not indicate changes in social acceptability of Motua settlers among urban, educated and often upper caste Bengali population of the islands. Derogatory remarks like calling the Motuas a band of idiots, ek murkher dol, not worthy of being considered bhadralok, are unfortunately common even today. Coming back to the Jatra Gan party, there was only one folk theatre troupe in Andaman Islands, which was assembled by Shomoresh Bapari and others during their stay in Mana camp. He assembled this folk theatre group comprised of performers from Faridpur, Borishal and Khulna districts, who were known for their acting talent in East Bengal and had found their way into the mainland camps. He had handpicked the players for the dal and made sure that all of them were recruited by RVD and brought to Andaman. When it turned out that many of them belonged to the small trader category of refugees and thus ineligible for rehabilitation in Andaman, Bapari fought tooth and nail with the island administration to ensure that they remain in the islands. The colourful recollections of the folk theatre stood out as a happy relic of what was otherwise an extremely challenging early settler life. The troupe was composed of 25 to 30 men, each with a separate responsibility like hauling trunks, painting banners and posters. They were also actors, musicians and technicians. In Andaman, the administrative officials would make arrangements for inter-island travel, but sometimes they had to manage on foot. So extensive was the repertoire of their performance that they had 7 to 8 trunks full of costumes, the arrangement for which had been made by the government. The performance would take place in the evening. This is before electricity reached the island villages. So they would put up 4 flaming torches or mashal lit by placing fuel-doused rags on bamboo poles on 4 corners of the makeshift stage. Later they started using hazak light or the Petromax lamp, which would be hoisted on bamboo poles on 4 corners while someone was assigned to keep pumping fuel all night. The troupe would issue tickets to their performances. People from nearby villages would start gathering in the evening, but the play would start later than the stipulated time in order to attract bigger crowds. Odhikari mentions they would even improvise and stretch their performances while they waited for more people to arrive. Moreover, if the performance ended too early, the audience, all of whom arrived from nearby villages on foot, will have nowhere else to go in the dead of the night. The show would end late in the night around 3 am, whereafter the audience would sleep right there under the open sky and leave around 5 in the morning. People brought their own sheets and pillows, katha balish, to make the experience comfortable. The second generation of RVD settlers too were involved in the folk theatre, like the current Pradhan himself, but they were not nearly as famous as people like Shomoresh Bapari, who were usually asked to play female characters in these acts. They would be invited to places like Kodamtala, Diglipur, Port Blair, Hurt Bay to hold musical performances. Some of these members could even recite Padaboli Kirtans, while others enacted the Ramayana. The veterans trained the novice performers over time, and these gatherings took place in the remote parts of the islands where the Bengalis had been settled. For instance, Haldar and his group were invited to a place called Kalighat in North Andaman. Even though the settlement is part of the Great Andaman Archipelago and thus connected, not disconnected by water, there were no roads connecting Billy Ground to Kalighat. The group had to board a boat from Mayabandar, which is around 35 kilometers northwards of Billy Ground. Another 80 kilometers northwards, they disembarked at the jetty in Diglipur, walked down to the settlement of Khudirampur, a few kilometers away, and after crossing the hills of Kalara, they could finally reach Kalighat. In Diglipur, they once held a folk theatre performance where the tickets were sold for 3 rupees each, and they had proper pandal arrangements, which was a matter of great pride for the troupe. They performed 3 hit jatras 3 nights in a row. On their way back to Diglipur, they stopped at Bengali settlements in Kalara and Nobogram to sing devotional songs at religious gatherings in exchange of some donations. The roads connecting the many settlement villages of Diglipur are still unpaved, so the group would walk through fields, wading through leech-infested stagnant water to reach the various locations. This is a region that is considered remote even today, but settlers like Haldar and Bapari never considered it a painful journey, as each of these regions had heavyweight Congress party workers, and it was the group's primary agenda to canvass for Bhaktoda, who is the late MP Monoranjan Bhakto. The Billy Ground group could be joined by other groups in Diglipur, and together they will carry out both the task of political canvassing during the day and Ramayan recitations whenever they halted for the night. Similarly, when rice was in short supply in the RVD area, some of the settler men would walk to Mayabandar to buy rice. They would halt for the night midway at Tugapur. Tugapur used to be the closest Bengali settlement for them, in a relative's house, then walk to Mayabandar the next day. Once the rice was bought, they would stay overnight and come back the same way, hauling 20 to 30 kilos of rice overhead. This essentially meant the settlers spent 3 days walking and halting in order to fetch a commodity as essential as rice. So, in manner of conclusion, this paper puts into conversation 2 concepts that have emerged in the recent academic research on Andaman Islands. First is what historian Uditi Sen talks about in terms of refugee labor, whereby the post-colonial state utilized the labor of refugees or citizens in waiting to carry out national development projects. And second, the work of Madhumita Mojumdar, Carol Aloria and others, which concentrate on the role of religion, particularly Motua religion, in creating a sense of home for the uprooted Nomoshudro refugee settlers in the islands. In the case of the RVD, I think it has the potential to bridge these 2 concepts, demonstrating a state-settler interface. In spite of multiple dislocations in their journey from East Pakistan to Andaman, the RVD-turned settler population was held together by cultural ties that influenced a lot of their decision-making and thereafter the rehabilitation trajectory itself. Establishing these networks at a time of greater insularity and disconnection due to the lack of infrastructure makes these intangible bonds and ties the lifeblood of this dispersed community. And a strictly bureaucratic understanding of the rehabilitation process eludes these parallel and arguably more agential networks that played a critical role in what appears to be routine administrative issues. Thank you.
I thank everyone for their presence, and I thank Raka Banerjee for her presentation.